I want to talk to you today as a doctor, as a physician, as a pediatrician, as a children's specialist about what the accident at Fukushima means to the population in Japan, to the people living in very heavily contaminated areas and not so contaminated areas, that this is really developing into a major catastrophe where the government, I don't think, really understands what it's doing. And a lot of the people are very confused, particularly the mothers, although they do understand their children and babies are at great risk. What you first need to know is that children, because their cells are actively dividing all the time, are very vulnerable to the carcinogenic or cancer-causing effects of radiation. So they are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to developing cancer than adults. Fetuses are thousands of times more sensitive. In fact, one X-ray to the pregnant abdomen doubles the incidence of leukemia in that child after it's born. Women are also more sensitive to radiation than men, although the International Atomic Energy Agency uses a standard white man weighing 70 kilograms to assess the amount of radiation that anyone can be exposed to. Not a standard fetus, not a standard child, not a standard woman. So their data is skewed to start with. Now, the radiation that got out of Fukushima exposes people in two ways, really. Many of the radioactive elements, and there are several hundred in the reactor, many of which escaped, they produce what is called gamma radiation, like X-rays. Gamma radiation is non-particulate. It goes straight through you when you're exposed, and only in that instant could a cell be damaged to later develop cancer. Cancer is caused by a mutation in a gene in a single cell. And this mutation of the gene, called the regulatory gene, will cause the gene to sit in a latent or silent or cryptogenic way for 5 to 60 or 70 years. And that is the incubation time for cancer. And one day, the cell starts dividing not into two in a regulated way, but it divides in an uncontrollable fashion into millions and trillions of cells. And that's what a cancer is, uncontrolled cell division. And cancer cells tend to be very aggressive, and they invade little blood vessels and travel all over the body. One will deposit in the liver to form a second cancer, or in the brain to form a second cancer. And thus the cancer spreads all over the body. And a cancer is like a parasite. It grows in a way that is unrestrained, uncontrolled. We as doctors usually can't stop the growth, and the patient withers away before your very eyes. And then eventually when the patient dies, the cancer of course dies. So in a way, a cancer has a life of its own. And we usually can't control that growth. What we try and do is dose the patient up with materials, chemotherapeutic agents that kill the cancer, we hope, while leaving the normal body intact. But it nearly kills the patient. You've seen patients on chemotherapy. It's just horrendous. And very often it doesn't work. We can cure a few childhood cancers now. And we can give people with cancer a prolonged period of life sometimes, not always. In other words, it's an incurable disease, and radiation causes cancer. And in medicine, the dictum says if you have an incurable disease, you must prevent it. So we must not have industries that will cause cancer, like nuclear industries. We have known that for decades. Now, when Fukushima melted down and exploded and all the radiation got out, there were some very short-lived elements. Now, I need to explain that radioactive elements have what is called a half-life. That means, say I have some radioactive iodine, and its half-life is 8 days. So in 8 days, you start with a pound. In 8 days, it decays so you have half a pound of radioactive iodine. In 8 more days, a quarter of a pound, and the like. And so you multiply a half-life of 8 days for radioactive iodine by 10 or maybe 20 to be careful to get the total life of a radioactive element. Do you understand? Okay, now many of the isotopes or elements that got out initially from Fukushima were very short-lived. But the very short-lived elements, radioactive elements, are very, very radioactive, and they give out a lot of gamma radiation. So large percentages of the Japanese population in the surrounding areas were enveloped in clouds of this intense radioactive material, which gave them very high doses of gamma radiation. Now, if you get a high dose of gamma radiation to the whole body, and we saw this first in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, patients develop what is called acute radiation illness. The high level of radiation kills the actively dividing cells of the body, which are the hair cells, so people start going bald. There are reports of people exposed at Fukushima who are going bald and losing their hair. They develop acute nausea and diarrhea as the gut cells, which are constantly reproducing, are killed. And they develop ulcerations in their mouth and the like. Reports have come in about patients developing those symptoms. And also the blood cells in the bone marrow that are constantly forming, the white blood cells, the red blood cells, and the platelets which cause clotting are also killed. So the patient ends up in 1 or 2 weeks, sometimes bleeding to death because they can't control their clotting mechanism, or with massive infection because the white blood cells have been killed which fight infection. That's called acute radiation illness. There are reports, anecdotal, there's been no epidemiological decent study done thus far, of some of the workers who are exposed to very high levels of radiation, and some of the public nearby, including children who've had nosebleeds. Women are reporting their hair is falling out and the like, and that could be attributed to those people being exposed to high levels of gamma radiation. But we will not know till we take a group of these people in a population and compare them to a non-exposed population to work out whether this is really happening in a statistically significant fashion. Now, a lot of these elements landed on the ground. You know, people were exposed by being in a cloud, but also they landed on the ground. And when they land on the ground, they emit gamma radiation. So children playing in schoolyards, their shoes pick up the radiation, but they're exposed to gamma radiation, which travels up into their bodies. And this is really quite common now. It's ubiquitous. There are very many areas around Fukushima and Fukushima Prefecture and Fukushima City, and even in Tokyo and even the south of Tokyo, where they're finding high levels, very high levels of gamma radiation. So these children and adults are being exposed all the time to gamma radiation. And then what people do is that if they walk inside with their shoes, they deposit this dust with the radioactive elements in the house. So this is a real problem. And you can't clean up radioactive elements. You can't clean up Fukushima Prefecture. It's a myth to say that there could be a cleanup. Absolutely ridiculous. How on earth can they remove millions of tons of radioactive soil, and where are they going to put it anyway? So the obvious answer is that people in high radiation areas should now be, and should have been right at the beginning, evacuated to the south of Japan, where there's virtually no radioactive contamination.